Hello, everyone. I'm Rajendra Roy, the Celeste Bartos Chief Curator of Film at the Museum of Modern Art. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to this very special conversation with Mark Harris on the occasion of Mike Nichols' Bookends, our revisit of a 2009 retrospective that we did for Mike. It's such a pleasure. I want to start by thanking, of course, Chanel, our year-round sponsor for all things film here at MoMA, and to all of you members who are joining us. And for those of you who aren't members, please consider it, because it would allow you access to view the films we pulled together as part of this mini retrospective of Mike's work on our virtual cinema. I want to thank Sean Egan, our senior producer in the film department, for helping us pull together that retrospective, and Isabel Custodio with our creative team, who really is the biggest Mark Harris / Mike Nichols fan at MoMA. And I want to thank her for making sure this happened. And welcome, Mark. Welcome back to MoMA.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be doing this with you.
Yeah, no, it's clearly something that I've been thinking about for a while, ever since you were kind enough to have lunch with me and talk about the book that you were developing, which is now a bestseller. And I've been excited for this talk, but now that you've been on Colbert, I'm like, okay, there's no way I can compete.
I know, I've had a really interesting national tour from my dining room.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can imagine plans were upended, but one plan that I'm sure you hope for, we all hope for, who you knew this book was coming, was that it would be a bestseller, and congrats on it achieving that with rapid pace.
Thank you so much. It's just exciting to know that people are interested in Mike's story and in his work. I mean, it's really fun to see this book being used as a gateway to people discovering or rediscovering his movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was saying just before we started taping that, you know, in this pandemic era and in our virtual Zoom era, you know, a lot of pathways of nostalgia and remembrance and recollection have opened up. And this has been one of the most fruitful for me and most inspiring, re-inspiring. So I just want to thank you for sticking with it and giving this to us now. I think it just feels really important.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to have it out in the world.
So I thought, as topic one for this discussion, we could start with improvisation, because in a way it's part of how Mike started out. And, you know, it's something those of us who had the pleasure of knowing him in his lifetime, and certainly those of us who had the pleasure of working with him, knew that he would sometimes, you know, he would switch between super serious and slyly kind of flip. And so on the topic of improvisation, sometimes he would, you know, just say, well, it's just making it up as you go along. But as you know, and as you point out in the book, it really is also, or perhaps much more so, about forging a path when none exists, or none exists for you in particular as an individual arriving at a place and trying to forge ahead. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. I mean, you really make clear how formative his ability to navigate improvised situations, and obviously, you know, literal improvisation on stage, and how you blended that with crafting your story. Like, how much did you have in mind as you set out, and how much did you make up as you went along?
Well, that's a great and complicated set of questions. I mean, I think improvisation is an incredibly important part of Mike's story. Improv, without giving away any spoilers, is literally the last word of this book. And in some ways, it could also be the first word, because there is this kind of chain that goes from Mike as a young immigrant kid who has no hair, who doesn't look or sound like other kids, doing his first observation / improvisation, just trying to see how other kids behave and pick up things from them and create a persona just as a means of surviving in the world, to Mike improvising on stage and becoming part of this famous comedy team with Elaine May, and specifically creating a kind of comedy that was rooted in very particular observation and specificity. So, you know, within that improvisation, there's a lot of pre-planning and a lot of realizing how important it is that performance have touch points in it for the audience that, as Mike used to say, make you and the audience feel, oh, I know that person, I am that person. And then that connects to his whole approach to actors as a director, helping them find those moments, and the relationship that Mike develops to improvisation once he's directing, I think is really interesting, because he wasn't the kind of director who said, well, let's just roll film and see what happens. I mean, he did that on very specific occasions, including the last shot of The Graduate with Benjamin and Elaine in the back of the bus. But even for something like The Birdcage, for instance, where he's working with a master of improvisation, Robin Williams, and with Hank Azaria, who's a great improviser, and Nathan Lane, who's a great improviser, his attitude was, let's do it all in rehearsal, go wherever you want. I will probably not be able to control my laughter, but do anything you want. Then let's pick the best of it, talk about what works and what doesn't, and put it in the script. Because when we film, I don't want you improvising. Like, I want you to stick to it. So he was very aware of when it was a good thing to be freewheeling and when it could actually get in the way.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about that. I mean, one of the big lessons he taught me or helped me learn was convincing the room that you're the guy or you're the gal, right? And you know, when I organized Mike's retrospective in 2009, you know, I was brand new at MoMA, and you know, I arrived in the chief curator position very green and you know, very young for someone in that position, and so it was a huge privilege to work with a master like Mike, but also a huge learning lesson for me of how to convince everybody here at the museum that no, I was the guy, I could do this. And Mike kind of took my hand, but he did that also because it was his first time in a situation like that, right? Like, he had never been invited to have even a survey of his work at a place like MoMA. And so he was kind of like convincing the room that, I should be there with all those European auteurs or who everybody thought should get a retro at MoMA, right? But I did want to flip it back to your process in writing the book, and how much you had kind of laid out for you until you got to that scripted phase, you know, that you described in The Birdcage, for example. Like, how did you go from gathering all this to laying out an outline of how you thought the narrative would roll out?
Well, I spent about 3.5 years on research before I started writing. The writing itself was about a year. And I would say that by the time I started to write, and of course I did outline the book, I knew pretty well what shape I wanted it to take. But that shape was very different than what I might have imagined it would have been when I started the research. I mean, I think the only thing that really stuck was I knew that I wanted to do a straightforward chronological biography, because I think the only way I could make sense of Mike Nichols's life and career and choices to myself was to understand the order that they happened in. You know, I don't think that everything is determined by the thing that's just before it, but I think a lot is determined by, you know, you pick project B because you're coming off project A, or you're distracted by project C, so you don't think about what's going wrong with project D, or, you know, marriage number 2 has just fallen apart and this is where your head is, so you need distraction and this is what you want to do. I think you have to tell someone's story, or at least I had to tell Mike's story in order for it to be legible to people and in order for me to understand it. But besides that, and besides knowing that I wanted to begin with him on the boat, there's a vast amount that became really important to the story. Everything from the number of times in Mike's life that he wrestled with depression, to how important and recurring a theme Mike's failures and his strategy for recovering from those failures was. That was all stuff that really didn't emerge for me until I was well into research. And then even when it came time to write, I ended up doing what I usually do, which is the book is 35 chapters, and I have a very close outline at any given time for about 2.5 chapters in advance. Like that, by the time I get to that point, that's when I know, like I'm starting to make notes to myself, like I'm going to use this quote to transition from this section to this section, and this is going to be about that length. But I find that after about 2 or 3 chapters of thinking ahead, things get a little blurry and a little vague for me, and there are some things that I figure out only in the writing, and that can be as basic as, like, where does this chapter end? What really is the beginning of the next chapter? What's the important emotional beat in this? It sometimes I only figure things out through writing, but mostly, since we were talking about improv, I don't want to leave that to chance. I would like to at least try to figure things out beforehand so that I'm not caught completely flat-footed when I start to write.
I'm glad you mentioned blurry, and I will admit, at this point when we're taping this, which is a bit before the series will launch on our virtual cinema, I haven't finished the book, and part of the reason is I want to stew in it because of something that. So next topic, another true Mikeism is this idea of versions of the story, right? And so every chapter I'm reading, I like to sit with it and try and remember the version of the story that Mike told me about that.
Right.
Which you get to, but like there are so many versions of every story depending on which friend, and he had hundreds of friends, he told that version to. And so I am so curious, like how you, in all your interviews, all your research, began to filter the versions of the stories. And again, it's part of it is that improv part of telling a better story, depending who you're with, and hitting the beats with the person, he was with at the time, because it would play better as a story. Yeah, how did you filter that? And then the follow-up would be, what was the most adapted story that you came across? Like, what was the story that people told you that you heard the most versions of?
Well, you're so right. First of all, I mean, some of Mike's famous stories, there are 8 or 10 different versions of, and I mean, and there are places, including literally on the first page of the book, what I deliberately tell a story that Mike liked to tell about himself, and then immediately say, this was a story, and he told different versions of it, and here's another version he told, because I did want readers to know from the beginning that this was a thing in Mike's life. In terms of strategies for sort of sorting them through, I think sometimes, as I do on the first page, you have to admit that you don't know. That's a legitimate thing to do. It's certainly more legitimate than just flatly deciding that you found the true one, because usually it happens to be the one you like the best. But I think there are certain sort of rules that I found useful. One is that the version of the story that was told closest to the time the story happened is usually truer than the version that was told on a talk show, 40 years later. A version of the story that he told friends, a close friend, is probably truer than a version of the story that he told a journalist. And of course, a version of the story that can be corroborated by someone else who was in the room. That's really what I looked for a lot of the time. In terms of the story that's most impossible to find the truest version of, I think it really has to be the way he met Elaine May, which was so shrouded in kind of myth and mystery that even Mike at one point said this thing, which is almost my favorite quote of his in the book. He said, "I met Elaine several different ways," which feels like both true, because we've probably all had a version of that experience. Like when you meet someone close to you, sometimes you remember the exact moment, and sometimes you remember that they kind of came into your life from 3 different directions at once. But it's also very true to Mike in terms of, it's a little moment where he admits that there's so many stories around this that, you know, if there's a real one, he's never going to let you know. So in that case, you know, I had the good fortune to have Elaine May to talk to, and she gave me her clearest memory of how it unfolded. And I tried to, throughout the book where things like that came up, I tried to present an amalgam of things that felt to me like they added up to the most credible and most honest version of any story involving Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's one of the most delicious elements of your book is the fact that, you know, we can like project ourselves into the like kind of strategies that he would have in coming up with different versions. My favorite story that there are versions of is the Marilyn singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." And like the way Mike told me, and maybe this is the way it actually was, but like that he was standing directly behind her as she went on stage to sing, and that her dress had split down the back and he could see her ass like through the crack in her dress, and that he had the best view in the house, basically.
You know, I don't know about the split dress, which is something I did not put in the book, just because I'm always really wary of the things that feel too perfect.
Exactly.
But the standing right behind her is very credible. I mean, that you know, Mike and Elaine were definitely there for the big birthday celebration, I think at Madison Square Garden, and Mike was in fact there for an astonishing number of major things. I used to, there were a couple of times when I would just throw a celebrity name at him because he literally knew everyone. And so I would say, like, this wasn't for the book, obviously, because I had no idea I was doing a book when Mike was alive and when I knew him. But I would say, so Mike, Judy Garland. And he would be like, interesting story. I went to her Carnegie Hall comeback concert with Richard Burton. And, you know, he'd be off to the races. There was literally, you could not throw a name at anybody. You could not throw a name of anybody at Mike and have him draw a blank. I mean, he literally worked with everyone from Lillian Gish to Natalie Portman. So that kind of covers.
That's it. That's the spectrum.
Right. Yeah. It's, I mean, the sorting through the stories thing is really fascinating. And Mike, as a director, used to say something to actors that I really love, and that I tried to apply to this book, which is, if they were doing like the one thing too many, he would say, let's not put a hat on a hat. And so I tried to remember that with some of his stories, that if there was a detail that was great but maybe felt like a hat on a hat, I tended to leave it out.
Yeah, I think that may have been the case with this one, and just him knowing that I appreciate a dirty joke, he may have just added the crack and the split in the dress. But you know, it kind of leads to, but not really, my next topic, which is humiliation, which I think, you know, again, was so formative to Mike, you know, especially in, you know, his early years, just in his own physical body, and, you know, feeling other different because of his hair loss, and, you know, because he was an immigrant, and on all of these things, but also his his ability to take a humiliation and grow from it, and bond with someone when they embraced their own humiliation. Because part of that is, it's when you put yourself out there that the potential for true humiliation exists. And I'll tell you I have a like literally visceral Mike and Elaine, I have to say, humiliation moment, but maybe talk a little bit about how formative that was, and how you really kind of ground his narrative in that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Mike's own brother, who's a lovely man, he's a physician, said that Mike's hair loss, which happened at 4, was the defining event of his childhood, especially when you consider that his father, when he was a little boy, didn't allow him to wear any kind of hairpiece. That that was the sort of 1940s psychology of the time, saying like, oh, it's best that he just get used to it. So of course he was the target of immense cruelty when he was a kid, and became quite isolated at times. Although once he got into high school, he was allowed to wear a toupee. He had friends, and he had a much more normal existence. But I think in Mike's childhood, we see all of the possible ways that you can handle something like that. He becomes depressed. He spends a lot of time by himself, including escaping into his neighborhood movie theater on the Upper West Side, where he also goes to escape his fighting parents. He becomes defensive. He becomes really expert, even as a teenager, at crafting a persona that will allow him to present a kind of picture of invulnerability, of impermeability to the world. And then sometimes that persona is really nasty. As he gets older, it evolves from a very nasty persona to a kind of self-assured and unflappable persona. I mean, but it's all a reaction to something that was deeply painful and traumatic. And I think that's one, how do you cope with failure, is, especially public failure, is, I think, a fascinating question for any artist, and really a defining thing about them. When I was working on this book, even in the research phase, I found myself really obsessed with his third movie, Catch-22. And at first I thought, well, I must be obsessed with this because I wrote a lot in my first book, Pictures of a Revolution, about The Graduate. The Graduate was a big part of that. And I thought, okay, so Catch-22 is the first time I'm going chronologically beyond that first book. It's the newest thing I've ever written about in a book so far, so I want to know everything about it. But as I researched it more, I realized that the reason I was becoming obsessed with it is it was Mike's first failure.
Yeah.
And it was a big failure. It was a big, expensive, noisy studio failure that was not critically well received, and lost a lot of money. And, I think that you and I can talk about how Catch-22 has a lot of really interesting stuff in it, and is absolutely a movie worth seeing. And I think even Mike came around a little bit about it in later years.
Yeah,
and kind of confessed that he liked a lot of it. Yeah. But at the time, this was a movie that was just completely mowed over by MASH, and that was seen as like, aha, Mike Nichols has his comeuppance at last. And how he reacted to that is so interesting to me. I mean, he doesn't get defensive. He doesn't really freak out. He's very dejected when he sees MASH a few months before Catch-22 opens, but he's not dejected particularly because he thinks, oh, MASH is going to ruin the reception of my movie. He's dejected because MASH is the movie he wishes he had made. So it's a very non-defensive, non-paranoid experience of failure. And then the first real emotional thing he experiences is almost a kind of exhilaration that he has survived. Like,
Yeah.
there it is. I've had a big failure. I'm still here. I still get to work. And coming right out of that, he develops this strategy that serves him, I think, quite beautifully for decades to come, which is, he says, the thing to do after you've had a big public humiliation or a big public failure is turn, in terms of work, turn to something small for which you have very few expectations, just because you love it, just because you're grabbed by the material and you want to work with the material or the writer or the actors. And in the case of Catch-22, he turns to carnal knowledge.
Amazing.
And, you know, makes, I think, one of his greatest movies, and a movie that is still this incendiary thing 50 years later. But over and over again after that, you see Mike dealing with failure in a very forthright, open way, and even in his 70s, looking at failure and thinking, what did I do wrong? How can I do better? I find that one of the most, I don't think all of Mike Nichols' story is inspiring, but that was something I found very inspiring.
Truly. And you know, we actually launched his retrospective with Carnal, because, you know, I certainly felt, and I think he agreed in the end, that it was a touchstone. It did represent something really truly authentic. I mean, he was mature enough as a filmmaker at that point where it just hit every single beat, working with Jules Pfeiffer, you know, like it brought his coterie of collaborators together in a great way. But it was also, he needed to have gone through, like, he was at the apex after the grad, right? And then he had Catch-22, which was an impossibility probably from the get-go. So, you know, ask Steven Soderbergh, who helped on the DVD restoration a few years back, if it's a great work, and he'll say absolutely, and super formative for him. So, you know, that ability to kind of like look back and see where there are successes in those failures was also a super important part of it. But yeah, Carnal was, it just felt super important to lead with that in a way.
So I don't want to make you talk out of turn, but I know that you had an experience that I really wish I had had, which was because of that 2009 retrospective. You got to talk to Mike very late in his career, sort of straight through his filmography. And so, you know, probably better than anyone, which were the very few movies that even at that late point in his life, he wanted nothing to do with. Like, there, because I know there were a couple. I know from my own conversations with Mike that The Day of the Dolphin was a movie that you could never get anything more out of him about than an eye roll. He just thought it was a complete miss.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the great privilege, and probably the reason I'm still here working at MoMA, is because, like, nearly out of the gate, I got to watch every single one of Mike Nichols' movies alone in Titus One's, our big house, with Mike Nichols. And we literally, I mean, it was like, okay, what planet am I on? You know, but that's what he wanted to do, because he wanted, you know, again, he had never had the experience of even being invited to consider something like this. So he wanted to, as he put it, watch my old movies again, right? Like he had acknowledged that his work now were old movies, and he was such an old movie fan. I mean, he was such a cinephile, not in a kind of elitist way, but he just really loved movies, that he was acknowledging in a way that his movies were now old movies, and he was going to watch them, and he wanted to do that. But, you know, he was also Mike Nichols, so he wasn't going to do it, you know, with 400 people. But in doing that, there were a few that he couldn't even bring himself to watch again. Day of the Dolphin was one. And I do think that was like one grapefruit. I'm not going to call it a lemon, because I don't think there were actually any of those in his work, but he just didn't think there was anything to squeeze out of it. Right. As opposed to Wolf, which we did watch. No. Although
the funny thing is with Wolf, there's half of that movie where you can see what the appeal was to Mike. I mean, the publishing house scenes with,
Totally.
you know, these amazing actors like not just Nicholson, but James Spader and Christopher Plummer and David Hyde Pierce. You get the kind of nasty urban rivalrous, you know, petty little vendettas of high-end office life that was just kind of meat and potatoes to Mike. He loved that stuff. It was everything else, the reason for being of the movie that just escaped him. But at least you can find like, you could see Mike having one foot in that movie, whereas Dave the Dolphin, I think, is a movie that he felt he made for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And that was something he couldn't get past. It was almost as if he didn't want anything to do with that movie because he knew that his intentions were not pure, so to speak, in making it. It was a movie that he made in part to fulfill a contract. He owed the producer of The Graduate one more movie.
Yeah, no, and I do think that that stumble was perhaps the hardest for him in a way. It took him a while, right, to come back to movie making, and when he did, obviously with Silkwood, it was triumphant. But no, there were, you know, a few instances, but you know, the things I honestly remember is like when we watched Working Girl, which he hadn't watched in a long time, and he couldn't move afterwards. He just said of Melanie, my God, she was fucking fantastic. You know, and it's like, yeah, we all know that, we're all huge fans, and it's like, you know, it's a cult movie, or what already was it, but he hadn't gone there himself, right? He hadn't allowed himself to recognize just how, like, you know, transformational that performance was. And those were the moments in that real humanity, especially when you're sitting with a guy at the apex of his career. I mean, he had just, you know, I think he had just completed his last movie, but, you know, Closer was a huge hit. Obviously, Angels cemented his greatness for everybody around the world. But so I'll just tell my humiliation story and then move to the last topic that I have, which is a doozy. But so my humiliation, and it is, alas, I think, viewable because I think it exists on YouTube somewhere, although it's not going to be included on anything official at MoMA anymore. But it was an on stage. So we did, as part of the retrospective, Mike agreed to do a talk, and Mike being Mike, he helped get his biggest collaborators to join us for this conversation. So it was Buck Henry and Nora Ephron and Elaine, and last minute, surprise to everybody, Meryl Streep. So you just had this, like, and Mike, obviously. And so, you know, in Titus One, this incredible stage. And I prepared and I built out this program, and we had a very rare clip of a Nichols and May bit that was really hard to find that we projected, and all of this stuff. And, it was tough. Buck was cranky because Mike's preferences were for the ladies, who were the ones on the stage, and so Nora was a super pro, and just kind of like was there, and Meryl was in her glory. Elaine May was just like, forget it, and so she did which is something that happens apparently, but I was, again, such a green dummy that I just had no idea. And I never should have been on stage. I never should have moderated that thing. There's no reason in the world that I should have been the one doing that. But anyway, I did. Elaine May started pretending like she had never been on stage before, and that she had no idea what a lapel mic was. And so she started acting. And she was like, can anybody hear me? I don't understand what's happening. Where's my microphone? Where is this talking? And I froze. I had no idea what the hell was happening, what I was supposed to do. I literally had a panic attack on stage with these, titans of talent. Meryl Streep saved me. She was like, Raj, she literally put her hand on my my knee and was like, Raj, let me handle this. And she started acting with Elaine, right? And she was like, Elaine, this is a lapel mic. Here, it's on your shirt, and there's a cord. It goes down to the battery pack. It's behind you. Like, so they did this whole bit. And I somehow the rest of the conversation happened. I know steam was coming out of Mike's ears. because Elaine stole the show, right? Which was fully her intention, obviously. But that humiliation and the fact that, I didn't literally melt into a puddle, which I thought I would do because my, nuclear level humiliation at that point. Mike and I think we bonded even more after that.
I think you got a really good look at who everyone was and the danger of who everyone could be, and you survived, which is an extraordinary accomplishment.
I'm still sitting on a stage at MoMA, which is where we are.
Right. I would not have wanted to try to be the ringmaster of a panel like that at all.
Well, sadly, we can never have a panel like that because talent of that caliber doesn't exist in the world currently, or maybe it does, and we haven't unearthed it yet. But yeah. So anyway, chapter in my life story, that will definitely be one big one. So last topic is women, and so many different directions. But I mean, the one thing that for me, I think is the most profound observation that I came away with about his work or his working method, and I know we've talked about this, was his collaborative sense, is like really innate collaborative sense, and the fact that some of his greatest collaborators were women, especially at a time when certainly amongst film directors that was not only seen not as a priority, but maybe even a weakness. And I definitely think one of the reasons that Mike hadn't been celebrated in academia or higher institutions of cultural thought or whatever earlier was because he wasn't seen as like those auteurs of the era, right? These self-contained dudes who didn't need anybody, and they certainly didn't need a woman telling them how to think or write or act or any of those things that Mike actually really, really needed and thrived on, his collaborations with women. So maybe just talk a little bit, any observations you have on that front.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that there's this, there's this tone among a lot of critics in the 80s when, there's this long gap when you, as you note, Mike did not make any movies from 1975 to 1982 when he made Silkwood, except for this quick little concert film, Gilda Live, the Gilda Radner concert film, which in a way is his first, movie with a woman at dead center and no man alongside her. But in the 80s, there's this slight critical tone, not of disdain, but almost of disappointment. This tone of like, well, these movies are good. I guess he's sort of given up on being like the serious director that he started out as being. And of course, that period is when he works with Meryl Streep in Silkwood and Heartburn and Postcards from the Edge. That's when he works with Melanie Griffith and Sigourney Weaver and Joan Cusack in Working Girl. I mean, it's some of his most fertile, on stage. He directs everyone from Whoopi Goldberg to Glenn Close to Judith Ivey to Sigourney Weaver. I mean, to Cynthia Nixon to Christine Baranski. Really alone among directors of his generation. He was completely not just comfortable working with women, but interested in them. He liked them as collaborators. I mean, Meryl Streep, as he often said, woke him up, kind of lit this fuse in him when they worked together on Silkwood that made him feel, that he wanted to direct her for the rest of his career and that he would have to kind of race to catch up with her. But I think really starting with that incredibly fruitful 8 or 10 years of performance collaboration with Elaine May. There's no one else of Mike's generation. He was born in 1931, whose formative collaborative experience as an artist was with a woman, and with a woman who was not, setting him up to be the star, like who was at least his equal in terms of comedic genius and performance genius. And he really liked working with women. He enjoyed having them on the set. He enjoyed collaborating with them, not just actors, but screenwriters, costume designers, production designers. Mike was very open to input from anyone, but I would say especially from women. And it really is something that marks him as a unique director of his era, and it's fascinating to me. And this was something I really did not realize until I started researching the book, that hand in hand with that went a certain kind of marginalization or downgrading of his reputation for a time. That particularly around Heartburn, the male critical consensus was overwhelmingly, why is he bothering with this? You know, what is this nonsense? Why is he making a movie about a woman's perspective on her unfaithful husband? You know, when is he going to get back to making important movies? It's, you know, the movie has aged much better than the take on the movie.
Yeah. No, and I do think one of the really fascinating things that's been pulled out of your book is Natalie Portman. You mentioned her earlier. Her comment that, you know, he was the only male mentor she ever had who wasn't creepy. You know, and I would have loved to have experienced Mike in this post Harvey, post, you know, kind of awareness, the Me Too revolution, because I actually think he would have had a lot of insight and kind of like, yeah, this was happening, but here's what you had to do to stay away from bringing that on set, or acknowledging that. I also miss all the political discussions, like kind of when we were at a height. It was when Obama was running, and we all know how he felt about the Clintons, so that was fun. I'm glad he didn't have to live through Trump, but it also would have been interesting to have him with us in this era to kind of analyze what we've been going through.
I think Mike would have really understood Trump, and he would have said something surprising about him. I mean, I think he would have really understood the degree to which Trump was a self-manufactured exterior, but Mike was also someone who was widely interested in the world, not just movies, not just theater, but publishing, fashion, photography, politics, style. So his take on anything was interesting. And I working on the book for 4 years was really a way of extending a kind of mental conversation with him that I very much wish could have been a real one, because I still miss his insight and his voice about things.
Yeah, I miss him a lot too. But again, so grateful to you for giving him back to us now and for joining us here for this conversation. I can't wait to dive into the next chapters, and really encourage everybody to do so, and do so in tandem with revisiting his films, because there's a lot of him in those films, even though he didn't write any of them, so.
Absolutely. I think it's I hope the book is a good viewing companion, and just dive in. I prefer that you start the book from the beginning, but a lot of people are just going straight to the movie that they care about or the projects that they care about, and that's fine too. And you can also dive in anywhere in his filmography. You don't have to start from the beginning. And this lineup that you've created is just a collection of great entry points.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark Harris. Congratulations. And I hope, to see you here in person again soon.
I can't wait.
Thank you.